Dear organizers, dear participants, this is a joint presentation of full Professor IVANA JARAMAZ RESCUSIC and me, which reflects a joint research that we've been conducting for some times on the topic of the places of exile in Roman criminal policy, i.e. of places where persons who were sentenced to a certain punishment were deported or relegated under classical Roman law, specifically in the early Principate. The title of this presentation is Islands of Exile in Roman Criminal Policy. In the field of criminal law, within cognitio extra ordinem, from the early Principate, the Romans invented and institutionally elaborated two types of the exile punishments. Substantially, they considerably differed among themselves and were considered as self-sufficient and self-sustainable punishments. Although both consisted of constraints of the convict's place of residence, which meant that it was precisely specified in his conviction where he would reside. These institutes were deportatio in insulam and relegatio, each with its own legal prerequisites and consequences. This brief oral review will not address the institutes in whole, nor will it explain its historical developments or peculiarities. Rather, following the title of the conference, Mare Nostrum, the authors will explore solely the role and the rationale of the convict's banishment to a specific island from perspective of that particular type of punishment, the overall criminal policies and the specific criminal goals that the Roman authorities achieved not solely by selection of an island, but also by exposure of the convict to the island's unique living conditions. After it was institutionally shaped in the first years of the Principate, deportatio in insulam consisted of a forced removal of an individual who was sentenced, and the sentence gained its full effects from the place of his residence. Simultaneously, it meant the lifelong internment to a certain remote island or to a desert oasis. The forced removal and the upcoming internment was inevitably connected to a loss of the Roman citizenship, capitis deminutio media, and confiscation of all of the convict's property that he had in the moment of conviction, ademptio bonorum. Such deportation was of an unlimited duration, i.e. lifelong, which was consistently followed even after the convict's death, because ordinarily not even his corpse, if he died in the place of deportation, could be transferred to Rome or somewhere else unless such an act was approved by the explicit decision of the emperor, which was granted exclusively on the case-to-case principle. Deportatio and relegatio had certain analogies and touching points. They referred to a place where the punishment was enforced, to punishment's duration, the extraordinary sanction of ademptio bonorum which followed the sentence, reflection of the conviction to a person's social and legal status, and finally, certain similarities can be discerned even in the persons or authorities who impose the penalty. If we concentrate more specifically to the places where the penalty was enforced, we may say that these were mostly islands, although with considerable differences between them. The most important difference between the institutes, rawness and the severity of the nature of island to which the convicts were exiled is explicitly attested by Modestinus in his fragments, number 2. Imposition of the penalty of deportatio in the city of Rome was achieved through a special emperor's act granted to Praefectus Praetorio and Praefectus Urbi. In provinces, such powers were granted to the praeses or proconsules provinciae. Although, before imposing the penalty of deportatio, they were obliged to deliver the sentence with reasoning, of course, to the emperor who made the final decision on the case-to-case principle by himself, or he might specifically delegate a person of his confidence who would then specify the precise place of the convict's exile. The emperor's decision was a point in time from which the sentence was final and received its full effects under criminal law. It is from that point in time a person could actually be deported to an island. Because the places of the exile are most relevant for the paper at hand, we addressed the legal and historical sources to determine what were the most decisive factors for selection of a particular island. It seems that the geographical and climate determinants, remoteness of the place, isolation, accessibility or inaccessibility, security factors, food and existential resources and water supply, etc., stood in direct relation to the crime committed, its severity, and ultimately to heaviness of the penalty conviction. These were most clear indicators that qualified heaviness of the penalty and the approach of the Roman authorities to the persecution and punishment of perpetrators. Actually, much more than the penalty imposed and proclaimed in the sentence, the islands of the exile may be used as an indicator of the individual criminal contexts in whole. The most horrible island of the exile in the early Principate were precisely described in the Roman sources and qualified as such. The rocky islands in the Aegean Sea, Gyaros, Seriphos, Amorgos, Patmos, Skiros, Skiathos, Donusa, Kitnos, etc. The same characterization received the steep islands along the coast of Italy and Sicily, Pandataria, Planasia, now Pianosa, Ponza, Tremiti, etc. In former islands, convicts were largely exposed to the considerable insecurities, primarily because of the emperor's vicinity and because they were regularly visited and inspected by the Roman military groups who often had special instructions how to treat convicts if specific circumstances occurred in the Roman state. The group of Cycladic islands, primarily Naxos, Cyprus, Crete, Rhodes, and Kythera, and the Baleares were often referred to as more desirable than those which were previously mentioned. Due to their size, Sardinia and Corsica most often serve as places of deportation, probably because bringing convicts there was easy and not connected with high expenses for the Roman authorities. Although Sardinia is often referred to as a place with deadly dangers, following the numerous marshes which negatively affected the local climate, and because the islands were heavily exposed to the attacks of bandits of all kinds. In the Principate, a small, uninhabited and waterless island, Gyaros, became the most horrible place for the convicts' deportation, which of course reflected the fact that it received convicts which were in the eyes of the Romans considered dangerous and whose crimes were perceived as particularly heavy. Tacitus reports that the Emperor Tiberius demanded Roman Senate, in course of the criminal procedure against Gaius Iunius Silanus, following the accusation against him on extortion, not to sentence him to a deportation to the Gyaros island and to make an exception for him because of the notable ancestry of his family, of the noble ancestry of his family, and the fact that he was a former senator. The emperor referred to Gyaros as a wilderness and as an uninhabited island, which is attested by Annales 368 to 369, and proposed he was exiled to Kitnos in the Cyclades, which was a bigger and more hospitable island. Tiberius put forth the same reasoning in course of the criminal process against Gaius Vivius Serenus, who was accused of a crimen majestatis. The Roman Senate stated in the judgment that he ought to be deported to Gyaros or Donusa, which the emperor opposed to by saying that both were waterless and that a person whose life was spared by a judicial decision should be allowed to actually live and not to inevitably die soon following deportation. A poet Juvenalis provides in Satyr, number 13, a clear reference to such perception by one of those crags in the Aegean Sea that are crowded with our noble exiles, actually the island of Gyros. Although deportation to Gyros was formally not a capital sentence, it seems that factually sending a convict to that particular island meant that he will die soon. Callistratus in Digest 50, 1353 states that deportatio did not necessarily mean for the convict that he would lose liberty, for which we may conclude that in certain circumstances the factual effects of deportatio could result with it. If a person was exiled to a small and inaccessible or uninhabited island with a permanent or periodical military surveillance, that convict actually lost his freedom through such deportation. Relegatio was a further punishment with incognitio extra ordinem, which consisted of constraints of the convict's place of residence. It was a type of an extraordinary exile which was much more present in the criminal practices of the Principate. It was considered more favorable from the convict's perspective than, for example, deportatio in insula. It was referred to by numerous classical jurists as a means of exile which consisting of interning the convict to an island or to a certain place on land or to a specified province with a simultaneous prohibition to come or to stay in Rome or to a province in which the emperor resided. Relegatio was contrasted to deportatio because it might be imposed as a penalty ad tempus, from 6 months to 10 years, or in perpetuum, forever. Moreover, it did not result with the convict's loss of the Roman citizenship. Principally, it did not lead to the property losses. It might manifest as a prohibition for a convict to be or reside in certain place, liberum exilium, or as a demand made to him to depart from certain place permanently or for a limited period and a permission to go everywhere he wanted. It might manifest as a positive relegatio when a convict was expelled from a certain place with simultaneous specification of his future place of residence. The former could be achieved through prohibition that he must not go to a certain place or differently that he was obliged to go to a certain place on an island, in the same province, outside the province from where he was relegated. Relegatio might mean that the convict was demanded to go to a specified place and to stay there permanently or for a limited time period with simultaneous additional effects of his convictions, ademptio bonorum, or loss of some property goods, or with loss of the social status and some other negative consequences, which might reflect to his social relations, for example, his exclusion from the curia, motio ab ordine, or sub motio curiae. Relegatio could be imposed by the emperor, the senate, prefectus praetorio and prefectus urbi. Until the reign of Alexander Severus, provincial governors were allowed solely to prohibit residence in a certain place or to banish the convict to an island or to some other place in province which was conferred to his governments. Because such a legation was insufficient, especially when the convict remained in the province where he committed the crime and in which he resided, Emperor Alexander Severus enabled the governors to prohibit them to stay in that particular place. The Ulpian's fragments, Digest 48:22:7:1, 48:22:7:6, and 7:10, added that the provincial governor had powers to relegate a person to an island even if the province had no islands, although in such cases he had to address the emperor and request that the emperor himself specified the island. Ulpiano specified more precisely the governor's powers, sed extra provinciam suam potest relegare, Digest 48:22:7:7. In the Augustan period, relegatio was for the first and only time introduced as the penalty prescribed by law for committing adulterium. Despite that, the Roman authorities resorted to it for pragmatic, political, and security reasons, for which its application was considerably expanded. The most famous convicts under Augustus were his daughters Julia and the granddaughter of the same name, who were relegated to the Mediterranean islands, Pandataria and Trinity Islands, for committing fornication and adultery following the emperor's judicium domesticum. August's daughter was forbidden to drink wine and to live a comfortable life. His granddaughter was left only pecuniary, which Tiberius later took away from her. In presence of Emperor Tiberius, the consul of the time, Marcus Aurelius Cotta, suggested in the course of the criminal process which took place against Piso and the sons before the Roman Senate for crimen majestatis, that Piso's son, Marcus, was relegated for maximal 10 years and that half of his property was confiscated. A poet Ovid, most probably for Lesio Majestatis, who was relegated to the Black Sea, Tiberius maintained such a policy of exile for political reasons. Agrippina, his daughter-in-law, was relegated to island Pandataria because she accused him for attempt of poisoning. He relegated his grandson Nero to the island Pontius for committing treason, and the Greek whose name was Xeno on the island of Cinaria, believing that he allegedly insulted him by stating he once lived on Rhodes and that all the Rhodians speak Doric language. Although Tiberius allowed the relegated persons to come back to Rome, for example, to Decimus Junius Silanus, who was a lover of Augustus' granddaughter, by explaining that there were no legal grounds for relegation. In 41 AD, in course of Claudius' reign, Seneca was relegated to Corsica, formally on the grounds of Lex Julia de Adulteris, but actually his relation to daughter of Germanicus and the emperor's sisters, who expressed certain political ambitions, which is put forth by Cassio Dio and Tacitus in Annales. Relegatio served as a means of political pressure and discrimination of most prominent philosophers and orators. In 65 AD, Nero relegated Gaius Musonius Rufus, a prominent Stoic of the time, to the horrible Gyaros for his connection with Piso's conspiracy, which is attested to us by Tacitus in Annales 1571 and 1459. Hadrianus relegated Favorinus, a well-known philosopher, sophist, and orator of the time, on the island of Chios for the reasons which are known. The legal and historical sources record many islands to which convicts were relegated. For example, Tremiti in front of the coast of Apulia, Pandataria in the Tyrrhenian Sea, Cercien in front of the coast of Africa, Planasia, now Pianosa, along the coast of Corsica, Rhodes in the Aegean Sea, Cyprus, Lesbos in the Aegean Sea, Capri along the Campanian coast, Sicily, the Lipari Islands, Meroe, big island in the River Nile in Ethiopia. Although some of the aforementioned islands were places of deportation too, they considerably differed from the small, rocky, waterless and dangerous islands which guaranteed death to the convict or at least harsh living conditions. The former list by itself indicates that the islands of Relegatio were more hospitable and close to the coast, which reflects main features of the institutes as well because it was considered considerably milder and favorable than deportatio in Insula. This brief overview, which will be considerably substained in the forthcoming paper by Professor JARAMAZ RESCUSIC and myself, of the island of deportation and relegation suggests that selection of a place of exile was an important factor of the Roman criminal policy in the Principate. The particular island itself, in the context of his features and disadvantages, and at the same time advantages, reflected punishment, its severity, and among all, the intensity of effort to isolate or remove a person from social life. Sometimes, factually, the exile to a particular island went beyond the penalty. Ides interment of a person to a specific island might mean that factually the penalty was much more severe or cruel than it was actually proclaimed. For example, deportation to Gyaros was essentially not deportation in insula, a punishment to live on the island for the rest of convicts' lives, but rather a certain guarantee that in short time he will die because of the harsh living conditions. The conditions and the time of exile reflected the danger of an individual. Deportation was always addressed to people who essentially endangered the emperor or the state and could not be revoked. The level of danger could additionally be recognized by analysis of the characteristics of the island. The more dangerous the person was, the harsher were the living conditions and the remoter was the island. Crime against morality usually evoked relegation to the island, which were close to Italy. Finally, the Romans were sometimes guided by the utility. In most cases, the convicts who were sentenced to relegation were sent to those islands which were easy to approach and which were close so that this would not result with big troubles and high expenses. Thank you very much.